Can you tell me a little bit more about your work with Islamophobia? From what I gather, you worked with a former student who worked on a thesis. What are the details of the project? I'd like to know more.
So the student Gabe Greenberg had seen a lecture that I had given on Islamophobia as demonstrated in political cartoons, contemporary American political cartoons. And he got sparked by that. My lecture was actually based on a similar lecture that a professor of mine, John Woods, at the University of Chicago had given. And so when Gabe got interested in it, he thought he'd like to do a thesis rather on the topic. And because he's a history major, he wanted to examine the historical background of American political cartoons. So he took the idea of looking at American political cartoons and gave that historical depth to it, and which really helped to flesh out the project in a fantastic way. And the political cartoons worked really well for this because the cartoons only work as a medium by being very small and concise statements that use a real economy of space to make fairly powerful comments. And so the cartoonists have to rely on the reader to pick up things pretty quickly. So they use easily accessible symbols and phrases and caricatures in order to do that. But they often also use stereotypes. And we see this historically in the portrayals of African Americans in political cartoons, in the portrayals of gays and lesbians, in the portrayals of women. Jews have all fought to resist some of their negative stereotypes that have been expressed through the cartoons, and so the cartoons work very well as a medium for demonstrating the Islamophobia that has been just unfortunately very pervasive in the United States.
So the project did have a historical depth to it, although you had mentioned that post 9/11 there was an outbreak or an increase in Islamophobia. This project wasn't necessarily focused on just the aftermath of 9/11. It took a historical angle to it.
That's right. What Gabe's research really demonstrated exceedingly well is that this latent Islamophobia, which we can trace back even before the revolution, expresses itself in different contexts according to the political and social circumstances and economic circumstances. So Gabe began his research in the 1950s when there was a concern among Americans for the Middle East that the Soviets were going to pull into their orbit a number of Middle Eastern countries. And even though the emphasis in the cartooning and among Americans at that time was on Middle Easterners as Arabs, not really as Muslims, but the stereotypes were on Middle Easterners as Arabs, if you look at the cartoons, one constantly sees lurking in the background various Islamic symbols, like a crescent, or one of the characters is kneeling in the form of prayer, that have nothing to do with the particular context or issue at hand in the cartoonist's mind. But the cartoonist, wanting to signify that this is the Middle East, uses these Islamic symbols in order to demonstrate that. Well, in 1979, with the Iranian Revolution, that all gets turned around, where suddenly being Middle Eastern is about being Muslim, when suddenly Islam is seen to be a threat to Americans because of the seizure of the hostages from the American embassy in Tehran. So, so that change that we see demonstrates really nicely the way that the Islamophobia can really burst out if the circumstances are correct.
You had just mentioned that in one of your goals is to get students to put aside what they believe is common sense and to challenge their basic assumptions about how they view the world. I was wondering if you had any specific techniques that you use in the class to accomplish that.
There's one technique that I found to be very helpful, and that is that I have students imagine what somebody on their hometown main street would say if they were given the words Islam and Muslim. What words would they associate with those two terms? So the students then start brainstorming, but they're kind of given and out that these aren't their thoughts, they're what the people on the street would say. Because if asked what their thoughts were, they would probably tend to be fairly guarded about what they would say. And by listing all of those on the board, I then asked them to value them, positive, negative, or neutral. And overwhelmingly, they're negative. And overwhelmingly, they also are terms or phrases or names that come out of the Middle East. Even though only 20% of all Muslims are Arab, most of the names come out of the Middle East. So that immediately gets them to recognize how centered their understandings of Islam and Muslim are on their own preconceptions and on American self-interest in that particular region. So that's a technique that I use.